Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, I'll be presenting a workshop at Fatima Elizabeth Cates Academy on Darwinian evolution. My focus will be on Darwin's two big ideas. So the first idea that I'll be focusing on is tree of life, according to which all terrestrial life arose from a last universal common ancestor, which was most likely a single-celled organism that lived in remote past 3 to 4 billion years ago. And the second idea I'll be focusing on is the idea of the natural selection that acts upon random variations. This process, according to neo-Darwinian evolution, is an undirected, unguided process. My intention is to show that these two ideas of Darwinian evolution are increasingly being disputed within the scientific community, and inshallah I'll be presenting some evidence underlining that.
Okay, first of all, Jazakallah for coming and taking out your time on a Sunday morning. I'm just here to introduce why we're doing this, and at the same time I'm going to introduce our speaker as well, inshallah. So, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wal aqibatu lil muttaqeen. Wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulil kareem. Amma ba'd. So, first of all, this is the first of many lectures we're hoping to have on Islam and science, and also other controversial ideas as well. And because it's the first, it's pretty much a trial for us as well. And that's why we would welcome feedback. And the way to give feedback would be obviously verbal as well, but best if it's given to us by email, so we can take all the feedback as well. At the same time, those of you listening on Facebook Live, if you can also put up comments on Facebook itself. If you have any questions during the lecture, it's better that you shout it out. There may not be so much time at the end for Q&A, so I think as we're going ahead, if you can throw out questions to Shaykh, we can take them as well. If there's anything that you feel you don't understand, or you feel that could be explained a bit more, straight away, it's pretty much an open discussion as well. So please raise your hands straight away, and Shaykh Usman is ready for that as well. Now, one question is, why as a madrasa do we need to hold lectures on science? Because today's lecture is not going to be about the theology behind what Muslims believe in regards to evolution. It is going to be pretty much all science as our first lecture, and it will be science facts. But saying that, well, Shaykh Usman has also said if there's any theological questions that you have, you are more than welcome to ask any questions on the topic as well. So why as a madrasa do we need to have the lecture on science? So there are many reasons for that. I'm not going to go through all of them because we do want Shaykh to start straight away. One crucial reason is the growing gap between the deeper understanding of science and topics and things like evolution, as an example on grassroots level, and what is actually being discussed at academic levels. So you'll find at times people who are atheists, sometimes they criticize people of religion of being in their own little bubble. But then when we do look at what's being discussed in academic circles, we'll find that it's pretty much similar situation with some of the atheists on grassroots and local level. So one of the reasons of this lecture is to facilitate the bridging of that gap between the understanding of science on local level, understanding of topics like evolution on local level, and that which are in academic circles. Also, the purpose is to start discussions on such topics that may be considered taboo in Muslim societies. And also to question, for example, if the question comes up, what do Muslims believe about evolution? What does Islam say about evolution? So the question would be, what do you mean by Islam in this context? What do you mean by Muslims? I recently attended a lecture by a professor who is quite well known when it comes to evolution. He did some research on what Muslims believe about evolution. So because there's so many Muslims out there, he focused on Pakistani and Malaysian doctors. Okay, and he gave many reasons for why he chose that part of the world, why those two countries. However, one of the interesting things was he asked one of the doctors in Pakistan, on what he believes about evolution. And the doctor said, when I'm in the hospital, I believe in evolution. When I go home, I do not believe in evolution. So there's different varieties of responses from Muslims. So we can't really, I don't think it would be fair to say Islam says this about evolution. Okay? I don't think it would be fair, and Shaykh can correct me as well. I don't think it's fair to say Muslims all have this type of belief about evolution. So similarly, Shaykh is coming here, and we're facilitating, inshallah, Shaykh and also other lecturers in the future. They will come, and our role in this is to facilitate the discussion. We don't, as a madrasa, okay, as Fatima Elizabeth Cates Academy, we don't hold any views. Okay, we try and stay away from any particular views, and the views that are discussed would be the views of the lecturers themselves. Okay, so the reasoning for that, and also one of the other reasons is the growing number of what we call in-closet ex-Muslims. Okay, so Muslims out there whose faith they feel has been challenged. And there's been no avenue for them to discuss some of the challenges that they face in regards to some of the scientific questions that have been discussed over the past century. So they've kind of left Islam, and but they haven't really disclosed it and openly stated that they've left Islam. But there's many of them out there, and one of the reasons for this is for them to come forward and openly discuss if they feel that there's anything challenging their faith. These are the platforms to discuss that. Okay. So, and also in the context, and I'll be finishing after this, inshallah. In this context, we've come across the new atheists and their hermeneutics of approaching all these topics. So there's, and Shaykh will go deeply into this as well. There's four things, or four hermeneutical perspectives that are used against, specifically in this case, Muslims and their belief in evolution. So one of them is scientism. Right? Science can or will be able to answer everything. That's where they begin. That's their world view, and that's what they project over everything else. So science can or will be able to answer everything. And just to quote a scientist who wrote "God is Not Great," he says, "Religion has run out of justifications. Thanks to the telescope and the microscope, it no longer offers an explanation of anything important." Okay? So there's questions and statements like this from new atheists, which we would like to kind of discuss and open up and explore. Second point under their hermeneutics is nature is all there is. So naturalism. So it's just about the flesh. There's nothing beyond any of this. And the third thing, which I think is very important, especially for Muslims, especially for our youth, is the concept that the argument they put forward is that Sharia law is barbaric. So this really hardline secularism. Okay? And just to quote Sam Harris on this from one of his books, he actually states, and again from the new atheist perspective, "We are at war with precisely the vision of life that is prescribed to all Muslims in the Quran, and further elaborated in the literature of the Hadith. A future in which Islam and West do not stand on the brink of mutual annihilation is a future in which most Muslims have learned to ignore most of their canon, just as most Christians have learned to do." So according to them, they want Islam to be a bit more Christianized in that sense. And lastly, which is a very important thing again, is the minimal nuances on Islamic texts. So their approach to Islamic texts is a very simplistic one, where the contexts have been taken out. So verses are plucked out of the Quran and used against Muslims. Okay. Now, all of this, I feel, fits in really well with the philosophy of Fatima Elizabeth Cates Academy. Our philosophy is that we are an academy which hopefully specializes in facilitating the cultural, experiential and conscientious, critical and creative growth of children through to their later teens by means of a holistic pedagogy infused with the synthesizing of traditional and contemporary ideas in order for them to have a well-rounded Islamic worldview. Now this can only happen if we do discuss some of these questions. So after this lecture, Shaykh Usman Ali will also be going to our secondary school class, because most of the secondary school students have already studied evolution at school. And we want to give them some Muslims believe about evolution as well. So after this, Shaykh Uthman will be going there. So the students are at the heart of all of this. Now, finally, just to introduce Shaykh Uthman Ali, and we'll start from there. Shaykh Uthman Ali studied from year 1999 to 2005 at the Darul Uloom London Seminary. Okay, it was at the Kent Madrasa. So Shaykh Uthman Ali has studied the Islamic side of everything. Now, after the Islamic, the theology, philosophy, and hadith, literature, and all the sacred texts, Shaykh went on to study biomedical sciences at the University of Westminster for 3 years, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah. 4 years. Okay. And then after that, MSc Honours in Hematology and Transfusion Science at University of Westminster as well. Currently, Shaykh is completing a PhD at the University of Portsmouth, School of Pharmacy and Biomedical Sciences. And the research title is, if anyone's interested in learning more about this, it's the utility of immature platelet fraction in discriminating the mechanisms of thrombocytopenia, guiding platelet transfusion requirements and predicting outcomes in intensive care unit. So if anyone's interested to find out more, I think that it'll be out in one of the journals. Professionally, Shaykh has taught Islamic sciences in various seminaries and madrasas in East London and around London. Scientific roles, Shaykh also has been a laboratory scientist since 2010 with experience in hematology, blood transfusion, biochemistry and immunology. Worked across 6 different NHS sites as well. Shaykh Uthman Ali is currently senior specialist biomedical scientist in hematology at Homerton University Hospital. Okay, so you may bump into him if you happen to go to Homerton. Some of the professional memberships include registered with Healthcare and Professions Council as a biomedical scientist, a member of Institute of the Biomedical Scientists, a member of the British Society of Hematology. Shaykh also holds Chartered Scientist Award from the Science Council through IBMS for demonstrating high level of professional practice and competence. And currently, we will kind of finish here, Shaykh is the Associate Lecturer Professional Development, Pathway to Learning and Teaching and Higher Education at the University of Portsmouth. So Shaykh has lectured there as well to second year students as well. And some of Shaykh's interests include multiple explanations in evolutionary theory and intelligent design theory, Islamic concept of humanness between evolutionary and or essentialist philosophy, possibilities of reclaiming and reinstalling the scientific methodology in Muslim scholarship, philosophy of biology with a focus on biological evolution, and lastly, the new atheist claims and the interaction between scientific and religious discourse in the 21st century, and that's where our madrasa wants to go into as well, especially for our students. One of the publications of Shaykh, have I mentioned this already, or is it the different one? Okay, it's the reference intervals for absolute and percentage immature platelet fraction using the Sysmex XN10 automated hematology analyzer in a UK population. So again, if anyone's interested in any of those articles and journal entries, they should be there. Lastly, and most importantly, Shaykh Uthman is also a member of the FEC club that we have at our madrasa. So without any more delay, I'll call Shaykh today. So Shaykh Uthman Ali, Jazakallah for coming.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First and foremost, I would like to thank Sheikh Hamid Mahmoud and Fatima Elizabeth Cates Academy for inviting me to talk on the subject of Darwinian evolution, as you can see from the title slide. I think, as Shaykh has mentioned, this type of lectures are a need of our time, and I applaud Fatima Elizabeth Cates Academy for being one of the first Islamic schools to entertain this idea publicly, because to my knowledge, this idea has not yet been entertained publicly by any other Islamic school. So I think this is a need of our time, Unfortunately, the problem is Darwinian evolution has become a taboo. And this is partly the reason why there is so much confusion amongst our youth as well as adults at large, because there is no interaction. This is not the topic that's being addressed at the mass level as well as in our education system. So there are a lot of young Muslims who have a complaint that Muslims have not engaged with the idea, and they study these things in their national curriculum, and then when they come to the Islamic school there is actually zero content with regards to this theory. So I think this is I applaud actually Fatima Elizabeth Cates Academy for being one of the first schools to engage with this. As you can see from my title slide, I'll be talking about the major themes of Darwinian evolution, and my focus will be on 2 textbook examples. So I'm going right at the heart of the theory and taking it from the biology textbooks, and then I'll be critiquing that. Initially, when I designed this presentation, I had designed it with a lot of textbook examples. Unfortunately, because of the time restriction, 1 hour or 1.5 hour, 1 hour 30 minutes is not sufficient time for me to address all the finer intricacies of Darwinian evolution. So what I've done is I'm just going to be focusing on 2 textbook examples, inshallah. So without going into any other detail, I just want to make a few disclaimers before I begin the actual lecture. Firstly, the opinions that I'll be presenting in this lecture do not represent Fatima Elizabeth Cates Academy necessarily, neither do they represent any other organization I work for. So all the list of organizations Shaykh has listed are not affiliated with my ideas of Darwinian evolution. These are personally my own readings, and I must acknowledge Professor Jonathan Wells, who is one of the senior members of Discovery Institute, for his 2 recent, one book about over a decade ago, which is called Icons of Evolution, and this is part of the recommended readings if you want to engage with the material of this lecture. And the second book Professor has written is called The Zombie Science. So this book was written in 2017, it's from last year. So if you want to see the kind of icons that I'll be dealing with today, these are the 2 books to refer to, and I would like to acknowledge Professor for that, for shaping my thinking in regards to this theory. Anyway, the second disclaimer I would like to make is this lecture is actually a short collection of information, and it is not a comprehensive overview. So you will appreciate that a lecture of 1.5 hours is not sufficient time to address all ideas in Darwinian evolution. So I'll be just focusing on 2 lines of thoughts. And thirdly, this is not the final answer to the question of evolution. Science is a dynamic enterprise, and it is ever changing. And no scientific question can be shelved as a final verdict on any particular empirical matter, because science, those of you who have had any familiarity with the history and philosophy of science will testify to the fact that science has gone several paradigm shifts. And those theories which were once upon a time considered the scientific consensus, as time progresses, they have been shelved for better theories. So science has gone these kind of paradigm shifts. So we are probably right now in a normal science, and then there will be an approaching paradigm shift even within the ideas I'll be sharing with you today. So if someone was to hear this lecture on YouTube or any other form of media where this lecture will be presented in 2025, for instance, and they find some evidence that has only been discovered in 2020, for example, then they cannot turn back to me and say, gotcha, you just made an error, that's not what scientific evidence points to, because I will just simply say that I'm dealing with science of 2018 and not 2025. So I will not be covering, this is not the final answer on Darwinian evolution, this is a critique, and this will be more beneficial for those people who have ultra confidence in Darwinian evolution, because there are people out there who think this is a fact of life and fact of science. So that's the people that will be most benefited by the material I'll be sharing with you. Fourthly, the main focus of the talk, as Shaykh has pointed out, is science. That does not mean that you cannot ask theological questions. Inshallah, we can deal with those during and after the lecture as well. So this is not a lecture that's based on interaction between religion and science about evolutionary thought. So the poster went out with a title to an individual given as a Shaykh, and that comes with an expectation that the Shaykh will quote from the Quran and the Sunnah, and there will be a plethora of quotes after quotes, and you will see that in this lecture we'll have not even a single quote from the Quran and Sunnah. And it's because I don't want to make that category mistake that when we're dealing with the evolution, it must fall on its own methodology. So here we're dealing with Darwinian evolution, so an atheist will turn back and say that you're using scriptural reference points to refute Darwinian evolution, and we don't believe in scripture in the first place, so why should we take you seriously on that? So I'll be quoting people that's from right at the heart of Darwinian evolution who believe in this stuff and have some kind of skepticism with regards to the theory. Fifth disclaimer, and this is very important, and I had to include this one because there are people out there, they listen to creationists or intelligent design proponents, and they get confused thinking these guys are out there to just debunk the Darwinian evolution with an agenda in mind. And the agenda is that Darwinian evolution cannot explain anything. My assumptions and premises in this lecture do not rest on that assumption that Darwinian evolution cannot explain anything. In fact, to the contrary, I believe that Darwinian evolution can explain some phenomena in biology, and I do not disagree with that. The premise of my lecture is Darwinian evolution cannot explain everything. So not anything, but everything. And lastly, I am not telling you what to believe, because people get very touchy about the subject and then they think that the speaker is imposing his views. There is no imposing of views here. This is just exposing you to some of the information with regards to the evidence that's being used for Darwinian claims in the textbooks. So the choice is yours. You choose for yourself what you want to believe and what you want to think. However, I do expect one thing from my audience is to engage with the material with an open mind and see whether these things make sense to you, so that you can look into this if you are interested in it, inshallah. So the session plan is I'll begin with an introduction that will last about 20-30 minutes, and then I'll go on to part 1 and part 2 of the lecture, which will deal with 2 big ideas of Darwin. Now, the YouTube video clip that went out, I did clarify that I'll be dealing with Darwin's 2 big ideas. So the first idea is the universal common descent, and I'll be critiquing that with mystery of Cambrian explosion. And the second big idea of Darwin is natural selection, which is the process or mechanism of evolution, and I'll be critiquing this with one of the icons that's used in textbooks known as Darwin's finches. And in conclusion, so this part of the lecture will be quite long, and then there will be a conclusion for about 20 minutes, which will be a scientific referencing some scientists who have dissented from the Darwinian evolution, and also showing metaphysical assumptions in Darwinism, as in Darwinism is a philosophy masquerading as science, and it's in our science classrooms, but actually if you look at the claims, they are philosophical. So what exactly is Darwinism? Now this is a question that's roaming in the minds of many of our youths as well as Muslims at large. Now Charles Darwin, he did not use the word evolution throughout his book on the origin of species published in 1959. The term evolution Charles Darwin avoided because of some historical reasons that I have no time to go into. But the term that he did use to define evolution is this: descent with modification. So there are 2 aspects here, descent and there is modification. Now this is a theory how Darwin explained how species, the life on Earth, diversified and evolved over time. Darwin's question was not how life came into existence in the first place. How life originated is a separate research domain known as abiogenesis. So that's not the question Darwin was primarily interested with, although there are some Darwin's theory had bearing on that question. His question was, how did species evolve over time once they have originated. So evolution is not about origin of life. Evolution is about how once the life has originated, what happens thereafter. How do species evolve over time? So Darwin addressed this question, but because it had some bearings on the fundamental question of origin of life, it has now been connected to abiogenesis. So this descent with modification is how Darwin explained the theory of evolution. So what does that mean? First of all, descent. Darwin, he viewed all beings not as special creation, not as special creations. Now, by that statement, this is a very deep statement that if there's no special creative episode, then Adam and Eve, Adam alayhi salatu wasalam and Eve, their creation has been ruled out by this subtle statement there. So he doesn't view that there's a special creative episode in the history of life. And then he goes on to saying, we are lineal descendants of a few beings. Now, Darwin's ambivalent with regards to the single origin of life. He is open to the possibility that it's not necessarily single, yet his theory implies that singularity in terms of the actual origin. So, and he does kind of go between single to few, but he never extends the idea to a vast multiplicity in the origin of life. And what is this? So he says single descendants of few beings which lived long before the bed of Cambrian system was deposited. Now this is a period in remote past, which is, according to Darwin, before a geological era known as Cambrian era. Now Cambrian era is 500 million years ago. Now scientists use relative dating or direct dating methodologies to date the fossils and the remains from that period, and that's how they know the time frame. So religiously we don't have a problem with that, because that doesn't have any direct contradictions with any of our theological assumptions with regards to creation. However, when Darwin said that, he's actually saying that the extant terrestrial life that we see on our planet today all evolved into what we are today from a few beings which predated the Cambrian era 500 million years ago. So before 500 million years ago, the life on Earth was not as diverse as what we see today on Earth. So in effect, what Darwin is saying here is universal common descent of all extant terrestrial life. Now this idea of Darwin became the central pillar of modern synthesis. And we have the secondly, modification, which is second part of Darwin's definition of evolution. Now by that, what Darwin actually meant is natural selection, which acts upon something called, he called it random variations, but the modern geneticists will call this mutations or some chromosomal crossover, unequal crossing over. So this kind of mechanism proposed to explain how the raw material is there for Darwinian natural selection to act upon. So this was his theory of how modification occurred. This is what one of Darwin's contemporaries, Herbert Spencer, known as he was a sociologist, English sociologist, who extended Darwin's ideas into sociology. So he applied Darwin's theory to societies. So Darwin applied them just to life. Natural selection is a theory that applies just to life. For Herbert Spencer, natural selection could be extended beyond life to societies. And then you have the idea of cosmic evolution, which is to the entire universe. So Herbert Spencer, he dubbed the idea of natural selection as survival of the fittest to describe natural selection. And Darwin, he considered this theory of natural selection as primary but not exclusive means of modification, and this became the mechanism of evolution. So,
I'll just ask a question.
Yes.
It says main but not exclusive. I know that you probably don't have time to go into all of it, but you normally hear natural selection as the main topic. So, what are the other contributing factors?
So the other contributing factors, there are several. I'll just tell you one of them. In the late 20th century, there was a scientist known as Mutu Kimura. He proposed an alternative to the natural selection being the main force behind evolution, and his theory was known as genetic drift. So genetic drift is not a Darwinian theory, it's a theory that genetic drift could be a random process, because natural selection is not that random. So Darwin's process was non-random process acting upon random mutations, whereas Mutu Kimura, his theory of genetic drift is purely random, and that happens through mutations over time, gradual mutations that accumulate and then cause the phenotypic, which is the actual organismic effect, morphological effects over time. So this is one of the alternatives that's given to the process. So there are several others, but I just wanted to call one to you, so that just to give you some kind of taste. Yeah.
There's another question. You know, the slide before you mentioned a Cambrian system.
That's right. Yeah.
Or error, whatever it was. I'm not a scientist or something. I
That's
just
fine.
wanted to know, when did we establish that Cambrian system, and how did we establish? Did we check anything which was before their fossils? Or because in 1809 to 82, science was that modern to establish these things?
Okay, the fossils have been discovered even during Darwin's time. So fossils is not a discovery that's a modern discovery. For even in Darwin's time, Neanderthal, for example, one of the Homo species that at the level of genus, it's at the level of species, it's not a sapien, but at the level of genus, it comes in Homo genus. That was discovered during Darwin's life, and we also had another discovery known as Archaeopteryx, which is a fossil associated with the reptile to bird evolution. Is considered by the neo-Darwinists as a transition. So there were discoveries even in Darwin's time, and Cambrian fossils were there, but not in a huge quantity as we have today. So now we have more than 75 animal phyla, which is major animal groups associated with different body plans and structures. However, in Darwin's time, there wasn't that many discoveries, so that's why Darwin was considering this a difficulty for his theory, because fossil record was scarce during his time. Yeah? So anyway, so the mechanism of natural selection that I just described is a gradual process and a purely naturalistic process. Now, in Darwinian worldview, the natural selection must be a natural force that can only be invoked for the explanations of biodiversity. So there cannot be a supernatural intervention at any point in the history of life. Now, Darwin has the following to say in a letter to one of his affiliates, Charles Lyell, in 1859. He says, "I would give absolutely nothing for a theory of natural selection if it required miraculous additions at any one stage of descent." So from that Precambrian period, where a few forms have then evolved into our current biodiversity on our planet Earth, the whole process for Darwin has to follow a naturalistic worldview. There cannot be any supernatural additions at any point. So theology will be blocked in Darwinian worldview, because theology postulates some supernatural intervention from a theistic God, for instance. But in Darwinian worldview, that cannot happen. So this is one of the things he postulated for his process. Does that make Darwin an atheist? Of course not. Just because someone believes that the life has evolved through natural means from X amount of species to Y amount of species over a period of geological time doesn't by default mean that that individual is an atheist. You can still be a fully fledged theist and hold to that kind of worldview. Not that the Muslims should hold to that worldview, but in general it doesn't make you an atheist. And Charles Darwin himself made that very clear with regards to his publication known as Origin of Species. He said that with respect to the theological view of the question, this is always painful to me, because he was confused. He never had a concrete fixed opinion on this. He kept fluctuating. So he says, I am bewildered. I had no intention to write atheistically. So Darwin never wrote Origin of Species atheistically. And if our modern militant atheists like Richard Dawkins seek
intellectual fulfillment, then he has right to seek that, but he has no right to impose that on Darwin or his intellectual offspring or any other theistic evolutionists or intelligent design proponents or creationists. All these groups can hold to some form of evolution without having to pledge to atheism. So here, 19 years later, Darwin writes a letter to one of his atheist affiliates, John Fordyce, and Darwin says, "In my most extreme fluctuations, I have never been an atheist in the sense of denying the existence of God." And he goes on to saying that towards the later part of his life, in the 70s and 80s, 1870s and early 1880s, Darwin was more inclined to agnosticism. So Darwin never in his life actively denied the existence of God. He was either a theist, which was an early part of his life, and towards the end part of his life, Darwin was agnostic. So he was neutral with regards to existence of God, but he never denied actively the existence of God. So what is Darwinism in a nutshell then? So to sum up what I've said so far, Darwinism is a pattern of common descent of all terrestrial life by a gradual process of natural selection, and that gradual process of natural selection is explained in Darwinian worldview as only explainable by natural forces at the exclusion of any supernatural miraculous interventions. So that is in a nutshell Darwinian evolution. And the two aspects, as you can see from the slide, are the pattern and the process of evolution. So you've got common descent and you've got natural selection. So I'm going to pick on a few biology textbooks to illustrate the Darwinism, because that's what my whole lecture depends on, because I'm critiquing Darwinism. And this is a book by Campbell, Rees and Mitchell called Biology. And this is a book which is widely used in universities at undergraduate level. And this is a particular textbook which deals with many big ideas in biology. And one of the ideas these authors deal with is Darwinism. And they have the following to say. They say Darwinism has dual meaning. And what is Darwinism dual meaning? They segregate the idea of Darwinism into two aspects. There is a fact of Darwinism and there is a theory of Darwinism. The fact of Darwinism, according to this biology textbook, is that modern species evolved from ancestral forms, and the theory of Darwinism is that natural selection is the main mechanism to explain the historical facts of evolution. Now there is a subtle point which I've highlighted in red here, is that common descent is being considered as a fact of evolution. And it's been taken to be, it's insulated in Darwinian worldview as a fact that you cannot challenge, because it's treated as a biological axiom rather than a testable science. So this is an illustration of what is being claimed by the textbook. You have Darwinism, you have fact of evolution, which is the tree of life thinking. That's a tree which is rooted in its root and bifurcating hierarchical pattern going outwards. That's the Darwinian fact. And the Darwinian theory is the process of natural selection. And that's the primary but not the only process, as I pointed out. So this is another biology textbook. It's evolutionary biology, and this is a textbook used at postgraduate level education in our country and also in many Western countries. And it's written by Douglas Futuyma. And the author has the following to say: descent with modification from common ancestors is a scientific fact. And he's referring to that universal common ancestry of all modern life. And this is a hypothesis so well supported by evidence that we take it to be true. So this is also considered scientific truth. These are things I'm going to critique, so it's not my assumption, I'm just quoting from the textbook. But the reason why it's important to know these is that I am not talking about what forums are saying or what the websites are saying. This is coming from the actual textbooks. Our children, your children, will be learning this stuff as scientific fact. They will come home and they will ask you that this is consensus of scientists, so why is it that the religion hasn't caught up? So these are things we must know or be aware of. So third book and the final book I'll be picking on today, and these books I'll come back to in my conclusion, is Ordusek and Bay's book on life, on science. And this book is generally being used in undergraduate introductory biology courses around the country. And these authors have the following to say. They say, the theory of evolution states that modern organisms descended with modification from pre-existing life forms. And then on another page, the authors say, virtually all biologists consider evolution to be a fact. Now, by fact here, they mean universal common descent. All life came from the single origin. And then on the next page, and actually the same page, the authors say the following with regards to the dichotomy which I drew out earlier on one of the slides. Although debates rage over the mechanism of evolutionary change, which is natural selection. So there is some controversy amongst biologists regarding natural selection, and the brother who asked me a question, I pointed out that there is another alternative theory there. So they acknowledge this, that there is alternative with regards to the process of how this occurred. However, exceedingly few biologists dispute that evolution occurs, i.e. universal common descent is not disputed theory. It is the mechanism and the process by which this occurred which is being disputed according to these authors. So why is universal common descent considered a scientific fact in the first place? The authors, they say, because an overwhelming body of evidence permits no other conclusion. Now, that's a strong statement a biologist can make with regards to phenomena. Scientists tend to be very tentative with their claims. When they write stuff like this, then you know you're in serious trouble, because they are telling you that you cannot question this stuff. This is not open to falsification. This is an axiom in biology that must be taken as a fact before you even start your research. So this is what we're dealing with here. And it's not that this textbook, Ordusek and Ordusek Bayes, are the only one making this claim. The claim is coming from many prominent neo-Darwinists who are elite evolutionary biologists, and many of our Muslims also read these people, and then they start questioning theology on some of the subtleties of religion. I'll quote you one of them here. Ernst Mayr, he's one of the prominent architects behind what we call modern synthesis of evolution. So we have Darwinism, and Darwinism, the modern interpretation is called modern Darwinism or neo-Darwinism, and it's also called modern synthesis. Now there are details to that which I cannot go into, but the point I'm making is that you can see from the statement on this displayed here that he is saying in 1991 that there is probably no biologist left today who would question that all organisms found on Earth have descended from a single origin of life. This is exactly what I've been telling you from textbooks. This is considered qat'i, unequivocal. There is no dispute with regards to this idea amongst biologists as per the neo-Darwinian interpretation of biology. Here is a philosopher of biology who was actually a Catholic priest turned evolutionist, and he also has the hypothesis of tree of life thinking embedded in his mind, and that's Francisco Ayala. And look what he's saying back in 1985, and he still regurgitates the same philosophical view in his modern writings. He says common descent is a conclusion established with certainty similar to the notions of such as roundness of Earth, the motion of the planets, and the molecular composition of matter. You do not question the roundness of Earth, so why do you question that all life came from universal common descent? So he's making a parallel here that this is kind of thinking that is so dogmatic that religious people bring to us, that life arose from a single origin. This is there is no dispute about it. But there is actually, if you go into the scientific literature, you find that that type of confidence is not there in the literature itself, and that type of confidence is more dogmatic, and is a public preaching of Darwinism rather than the scientific literature on the topic. Literature tends to be very tentative and modest. But anyway, this is what their public preaching is. And actually this was from a literature, but there's a select neo-Darwinists who make these claims, and not the entire a community of biologists agreeing with this. So, what are the key lines of evidence for universal common descent? So what do they use to prove that there is universal common descent? Now that's the objective of my lecture today. And that's what I'll be covering in the part 1. And the part 2 will basically I'll critique the natural selection. So critiquing natural selection is not of utmost importance for me. It's actually the tree of life thinking, because that's what really gets in the way of theology and religion. And we want to see that how strong is this idea in the first place. Now, one of the Ordusek and Byers book lists about 4 or 5 key lines of evidence. Key lines of evidence that permits no other conclusion. Overwhelming body of evidence, which I quoted, that permits no other conclusion. There is no alternative. This is so strong according to Darwinian evolutionists. So one of the key line of evidence they propose is fossil record, and I'll be critiquing that. And for the natural selection, what's the evidence? Here we have Ken Miller and Levine, who are biology textbook writers and well-known evolutionary biologists. They write about a finch population which is found on Galapagos Island that changed over time, and that's being used as evidence for natural selection in action. So this is the end of my introduction now. So we have the first part of my lecture, which is part 1. I'll be critiquing the fossil record, argument from fossil record, and that I'll be using the mystery of Cambrian explosion to show that fossil record is not as consistent and as overwhelming as the neo-Darwinists have you believe. And in the second part of my lecture, I'll show you that there are exaggerations with regards to Darwin's finches evolving on Galapagos Islands. And I'm open to questions, so inshallah, even during lecture, please do feel free if you have any questions. So now moving on to the first part of my evidence. This is a critique of universal common descent, the fact of evolution using the fossil record. And I'll be presenting the mysteries of Cambrian explosion. Before I do that, let's just display one of the pictures, one of the illustrations that Darwin himself put in his Origin of Species. If you ever get a chance to read the Origin of Species, let me just remind you that it will be a good way to put yourself to sleep, because it's a very difficult read. So I had the opportunity, alhamdulillah, to read it. So this book, you'll find that it's very detailed and very complicated, and it looks like Darwin was not in contact with the society of his time, because the kind of stuff he was talking about in 19th century, and he was innovative, because some of the stuff he mentioned was not mentioned before that. But it's a good read, and have a look through it. The only illustration you'll find in his book is this one here. That's the only illustration throughout the book. And look at the illustration. Darwin is showing how single species, if subjected to different environmental conditions over time, will diverge into myriad species over time. And let's show you one example. Here is a species A, and you can see little arrows. They're pointing towards a divergence of several branches, and these could be species diverging into varieties within species barrier, or if you extend the process, as Darwin felt that we should do, over a geological time. For Darwin, each horizontal axis there is about 1,000 miles or more. If you extend this over geological time, and I specify geological to show that suddenness, when I use these terms in my lecture, they're not sudden like a click of my fingers. This suddenness is a geological suddenness, which can be millions of years. So here, if 1,000 years or more is taken for each generation here, that's 14 generations. So Darwin feels that there is a possibility that over a course of thousands or millions of years, a single ancestral species can diverge into different species. In this case, if you look at species A, there are 8 lines radiating at the top, which is 8 species radiating from a single species. So he's giving this hypothesis. And if you extend the idea far enough, you will find that the species that have radiated out from the single species will ultimately go to the level of genera, then to the level of families, then to the level of orders, then to the level of class, and then to the level of phyla, kingdom, domain, and the entire life. So it's a bifurcating tree of the entire life. So it's just extrapolation just from that beginning, that you just need to evidence that according to neo-Darwinists, then the whole tree becomes evidence-based. So it's extrapolation-based rather than observation-based, or direct observations are more or less missing in this thing. Darwin himself never saw natural selection in action during his life. It was kind of theoretical deduction, not an empirical inference.
Just want to ask one question. Yes. As you have mentioned now, like it's a common or a single ancestor. Has anyone explained how did he look like? Like, we normally see the monkey doing it. Who explained that, or has anyone explained, or even Darwin did or not?
So Darwin was ambivalent about the single origin of life. He said God may, so he's left, even in the Origin of Species in the later editions, he added 3 significant terms. And that was, by God breathed. So I don't remember the exact structure of the terms, but he used the word creator in the Origin of Species. By the creator, that's right, by the creator. Now, that's a theological statement Darwin makes, because he couldn't explain the origin of life. So he said maybe the creator blew some kind of life into the original organism, which is considered the universal ancestor of the entire life that we see today. But he wrote a letter to one of his colleagues regarding that, because he got criticized. There is one thing, we're going to probably upset the sisters with this one, but the Darwin was criticized by some philosophers that he was scared of his in-laws. So his wife Emma was very religious. So Darwin was giving ideas which are very naturalistic, and they kind of go off track with theology. So because he wanted to please his in-laws, he added 3 terms in his Origin of Species at later part of his life, just to keep them happy. Don't worry, I'm still a believer, kind of thing. So the point is, Darwin was ambivalent. He never had an explanation, and he calls this, in a letter that he writes to one of his affiliates, that this is a rubbish thinking. He actually uses the term rubbish thinking. That I added these 3 terms, like creator, in my Origin of Species, but actually this addition is just rubbish thinking. It's just an unknown process how it happened, and I've just filled the gap with creator. So he was not comfortable to fill a gap with a supernatural deity. He wanted to fill the gap with a natural process. And then the later researchers, there are some who actually dispute it as well, who added that single origin. So it wasn't Darwin himself. Okay? So here the question now is, if the animals descended from a common ancestor, what should be expected in the fossil record? So we're talking about a gradual process over time. So what should be expected in fossil record if the gradual process was to go from the single origin in the entire pedigree of life to our modern species? What would we expect? In Darwinian worldview, you will expect that there is slight differences at the level of species, at the level of genera, family, order, class, followed by the major differences at the level of phyla, kingdom, domain. So you should never get a sudden jump in the fossil record. That's the expectation Darwin has through his gradualism. However, and actually I'll point out another point here. So Darwin is saying no great or sudden modification. There shouldn't be any sudden jumps in the fossil record. So here I'm showing 7 animal phyla, which is Platyhelminthes right down to Annelida. Now these are called animal phyla for a reason, because these are organisms that are so radically different in their body plan and structure from each other that they cannot arise spontaneously within over a very small geological time. So here we have these 7 animal phyla, which I'm going to use to demonstrate that Darwin's theory of gradualism in the fossil record doesn't actually work when you look at the evidence. So this is what the expected evidence should look like. You should have, in the red, you should have in the pre-Cambrian. By the way, the Cambrian is about 500 million years ago. By one estimate, it's started around about 541 million years ago, and it lasted for 55 million the entire period. And within the entire period, there is a narrow window, or about 10 million years, which the geologists, paleontologists call explosion, Cambrian explosion. Now you have a Cambrian explosion there of all those phyla suddenly just appearing in the animal fossil record without any precursors, without any ancestral forms, which is in the red. So there is a universal common ancestor right at the bottom, and in the Precambrian, the expected series of transitional fossils are missing. That's what Darwin's theory expects. But what we actually have in the fossil record looks like this. So you have, in the Cambrian era, a sudden explosion of animal phyla which have drastically different body plans arising suddenly. This appears to be very religious type of idea, because we believe that these animals arose, at least we believe for the human beings, that arose distinctly as a discrete species without any connection to any other species. So if that's what we believe in, there is something in the fossil record that seems to look a bit like that. Not exactly like it, but a bit like it. So you have a parallel kind of picture. So you have sudden origins at a specific point in history and a parallel evolution thereafter. So this actually became a kind of challenge to Darwinian evolution, which was based on gradualism that you should be seeing in the fossil record. Now this is a diagram showing species to phyla missing transitional forms. So you should have species level, then you have the genera, and then family, then class and order, then there should be phyla. But these white circles are actually missing fossils. There is nothing there that can be described as the ancestral to the phyla that suddenly erupted at the Cambrian Precambrian border. That's around about 530 million years ago to 520 million years ago. Now here's another illustration just to home the point in your minds, that here you can see the 10 million years window. Can you see that one there? At 530 million years, or 510 to 20 to 530 million years, there's missing transitional forms, and then there's sudden rise in the fossil record of animal phyla. These are animals with distinct body plans that arise suddenly in the fossil record without any transitional forms that can be described as their ancestral fossils. Now that's causing a lot of problem for Darwinian evolutionists.
I might have missed it, but can you explain phyla?
Okay, animal phyla, there are, for example, we as human beings, we are Chordata. Then there is a Platyhelminthes, there is Annelida. These are just names the scientists give to body plans. So our body plan fits into a category which is different to the body plan of, for example, worms, which is different to the body plan, for example, of spiders and crabs. So these body plans are so far apart in their morphology and structure that scientists refer to them as animal phyla. So when you get in the fossil record, you're finding remains that are so drastically different from each other, then you have to give explanation as neo-Darwinists. And the explanation that you have to give must follow a gradualistic process, not a sudden arise. And here you have a sudden arise of these animal phyla appearing at around about a window of 10 million years in a Cambrian explosion. So how did these, and by the way, when I use 10 million years, and you might be thinking that's a very significant period, it's not at all. Because life on Earth, according to the scientific worldview, has originated approximately 3.5 to 3.8 billion years ago. Now do the mathematics, 10 million years is a minuscule amount from that. In such a short time, sudden arise of such a large amount of phyla, we're looking at 75 or so phyla appearing in the fossil record. How is that possible?
How do neo-Darwinists explain this?
Neo-Darwinists give all sorts of explanations. So there is a scientist, a paleontologist, a well-known paleontologist. His name is Gould, Stephen J. Gould. So he seen this problem, which Darwin had also seen, and from Darwin's period up until his period, they couldn't explain. So he proposed an idea known as punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated equilibrium is a what that proposes is that you have stasis over a long period, and then there is sudden explosive radiation of evolution, and then there is stasis, and then there's explosive radiation evolution, then the stasis. So that then kind of, for them, explains this problem. But the problem with that idea is that that's just exactly like a theologian saying, oh, God created it. You've just exactly filled that gap with, oh, it was a punctual equilibrium, but what's the mechanism that happened? And there are significant evolutionary biologists who do not agree that punctuated equilibrium can explain, as a process, how sudden rise can occur in the fossil record. So it's still a problem. It's no good telling a theory without giving a process. So he gave a theory, but there was no process that can describe exactly how such sudden changes can occur in such a short period.
Just another question: Are there other examples of this over time? Similar examples of something like Cambrian?
There are other examples. There's a period before Cambrian explosion known as Adiakaran. In Adiakaran period, there was another explosion according to biologists. But that was not as explosive as this explosion, because here you're looking at 75 animal phyla. There you're looking at a very small amount. Now the reason why I suspect that they've also called that explosion is to kind of mask the idea that there is only one explosion, so therefore the creationists will use this argument against religion. So let's just multiply the explosion and say there are several explosions in the fossil record. This is my suspicion, because I've seen the Adiakaran fossil record, and it's not as significant and as pronounced as this, what we're seeing here. Is that?
Okay, another thing is,
yeah.
How do they attain these fossils? From where do they know, like, where do they go dig them? How do they, like, achieve, like, I don't know, acquire them?
They go into the field work. So you've got fieldwork scientists and you have laboratory scientists. I'm a laboratory scientist. But the fieldwork scientists, they go out in the field looking for fossils. And
anywhere? Like,
no,
they have pinpoint the areas where maybe
they pinpoint the areas, because what they do, like for example, there is a recent scientist who discovered a Homo naledi, which is one of the Homo species. So he looked at from the Google map the kind of shape of the Earth's structure, and then from that he made his kind of assumption that this area looks a bit more fossil rich compared to another area. So I can't remember his name, but Berger or something like that his name was. So they do have some ways to kind of, and there are areas where fossils are more well preserved compared to other areas. Sea preserves fossils very well. So marine fossils are more abundant than land fossils. So scientists know that because of the nature and the properties of how this fossil preservation occurs. Likewise, they know, for example, fossils may not preserve very well in very green areas. So there are some indications, and they can work out from that where to look. And these are people who've been studying this all their life, and they know that fossils will not be found in certain areas. There's no point looking there. Does that?
So is it theologically explained anywhere, like where the human being came, like Adam and Eve? I'm just trying to make a
okay, theologians, the Quran itself is silent with regards to what the time frame of Adam's appearance on earth. What is the time frame of Adam's appearance on earth? Quran has no explicit statement identifying Adam's creation, the time frame. But the Quran is explicit with regards to a creative episode which is known as special creation. So Quran is not a scientific manual. Quran is not interested in telling us each and every scientific detail, because it's a book of guidance, not a book of science.
Like no stories?
Sorry?
No stories, like just...
There are some stories which Quran mentions, like the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. And there are others where there is no stories, but there are very short injunctions rather than stories. And then there are certain other places where linguistically the ulama, they extract certain meanings from the words of the Quran. So here we're looking at a very ambiguous subject. The Quran doesn't have any explicit statements. This is why Islam is very open to scientific research relative to the Christian theology, because Christian theology has very literal statements about numbers which Quran doesn't have. So that's why we have a bit more leeway to do scientific research, alhamdulillah. So basically what you can see from this pattern is that the higher levels of biological taxonomy arise right at the beginning, and then there's a decline. So actually what you're seeing is Darwinian evolution postulates bottom-up evolution. So there should be, phyla should not arise in the fossil record so soon, it should come later. So it should be a line going up. But we have the fossil record the upside down. So you have phyla at the bottom, and then over time the phyla starts decreasing in number. And you see the dotted lines. So this is a pattern more typical of devolution rather than evolution. And that's the problem for neo-Darwinists, because they want for neo-Darwinian theory to be considered seriously, they have to show that in the genome of these species there is some possibility that through some kind of mutations you can increase the information and the pattern should go up. But what we're seeing is a degradation rather than an addition of information in the fossil record, and that's a significant problem for Darwinists. Now here's a paper from 2 decades ago. It's called Calibrating Rates of Early Cambrian Explosion, Cambrian Evolution, and you can see there are periods, and this is what I've been showing, that you've got Bottomian, Adabanian and Timoshian. These are 3 periods in early Cambrian, and these 3 periods are where most of the animal classes, order and phyla erupt into existence. Can you see that? And it's indicated with red arrows. Now and I've put an arrow, a question mark there. Actually, it's a question mark from the actual literature itself. There are missing transitional fossils. And how did you go from here to there suddenly, a huge rise? The explanation doesn't really hold water. The Darwinian explanation doesn't hold water in this regard. So we got a sudden rise, but then you can't explain it. So then how is it possible then, as Odisek Bias have said, which is we have an overwhelming body of evidence that permits no other conclusion. I'm seeing a lot of conclusions here that can be permitted if you were to open your mind a bit more wider and allow for those conclusions to be part of science, which scientists don't tend to do because they're worried that historically creationists cause problems for science. They stop the progress of science, and they'll get their opinion into science and they'll just say God did a contentment rather than allow scientists to do their job. That's one of the deeper reasons why scientists don't tend to allow any supernatural explanation to these phenomena. Yet there may well be supernatural explanation, but they just won't allow for it because they feel that religious people, and to some degree, unfortunately, I have to agree with that, which is that religious people, not the religion itself, tend to be very complacent with regards to research. So they allow, as a first resort to that God did it contentment rather than let me try and find out for myself what's actually going on here. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, isn't it, that observe, travel and observe and see, see what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created. See how the life itself originated. There's a verse of the Quran that even talks about that. Yet the complacency amongst our religious groups is to just deem it as it happened in a sudden occurrence and therefore that's about it and we will not be permitted to be on. So that's their worry. So they don't want that type of mindset coming into science, which is a progressive domain of study that wants to, and is curious. Curiosity is in the mind and heart and body of every scientist. He is not interested to just shelve a question with God did it contentment, although that is what we do. So theory versus fact. So theory is that you have a universal common ancestor from which arose the vast life that we see on the planet Earth, but the fact is that these are fully formed animal phyla originating right at the start of life. So what I'll do actually, because the time is short, is I'll just go to some of the criticisms within the scientific literature by the neo-Darwinists themselves. So here you got James Valentine, who is saying that Cambrian explosion is real, it is too big to be masked by flaws in the fossil record, and it was even more abrupt and extensive than has been previously envisioned. So during Darwin's time, the Cambrian explosion was not as abrupt as it has become now, because more and more discoveries are adding to that short window where I've shown you that most of the animal phyla arose in. So I give you example, Burgess shell fossils, which one of the scientists known as Professor Whittington is a Cambridge and Oxford professor. Cambridge and Harvard professor. So we're dealing with scientists at the heart of research, and he's more of an expert of Cambrian fossils than individuals like Richard Dawkins, Jerry Coyne, and their colleagues. These people study zoology, whereas these people study fossils. They study their stuff very closely, and they don't agree with some of the stuff that neo-Darwinists have used in confidence to the evidence that's related to fossil record. So here, he says, organisms with characteristic body plans that we identify as living phyla appear abruptly in the fossil record. And then it goes on to saying, none of them can be traced through fossil intermediates to an ancestral form. And that's the diagram I showed you. They cannot be traced back. Here we have James Schopf. He's saying the long-held notion that Precambrian organisms must have been too small or too delicate to have been preserved in geological materials is now recognized as incorrect, because that was Darwin's explanation. Darwin's explanation was that the Precambrian fossils were not there because they got destroyed or degraded because of the extreme heat in the primitive Earth. So he gave kind of an answer that you're never going to find them, so don't need to use that as evidence against my theory, although you have the right to use that, you have a right to critique that my theory using it, but you cannot rely on that independently. Yet Odesek and Byers are counting fossil record amongst the conclusive evidences for the theory. Now this is Harry Whittington, the scientist I just mentioned. He is saying, I look skeptically upon diagrams that show branching diversity of animal life through time and come down at the base of a single kind of animal. What year is he saying this? 1985. What year did Ernst Mayr say that there is no biologist left on Earth who questions single origin of life? 1991. Now do your own mathematics and see that Ernst Mayr is associating with the scientists in his field. This is a Harvard scientist. We're not dealing with someone who is ignorant of the field of evolutionary biology. And he's clearly saying that I'm skeptical about all this, the bifurcating tree of life. And then he says, animals may have originated more than once in different places at different times. Very unlike Darwin's theory. Darwin's theory wants you to have the animals originate a single origin, and here you have world-class, renowned scientists telling us that it may have originated more than once in different places at different times. Another scientist, Malcolm Gordon, resonating the same idea. At the macro scale, life appears to have many origins. Now, that is a radical anti-Darwinian paradigm to hold, but these scientists get away with it because they are not creationists. Had he had a religion associated with him, or he was associated with any religious institute, he would be on trial for what he's just said. But he's a scientist from the mainstream science who's just saying, and they'll just ignore him. They'll learn to ignore people like that. And he's saying that the base of the universal tree of life appears not to have been a single root. Now, one thing I want to mention before I move on to the conclusion, so I'll leave the natural selection critique and I'll move on to conclusion if that's okay, yeah? So, hypothetically, let's say, and this might be on your minds, that what if the transition fossils are discovered? So a lot of, a lot of theologians or people who are philosophically trained, they don't like to use science as evidence for anything, because they think that there's a problem of scientism, that science has a hegemony over evidence, and in our 21st century, science has become a big problem. Therefore, let's just destroy the epistemic weight of science rather than engage with it and say that there is some level of evidence there, so we can make speculative reasoning rather than conclusive reasoning. So you find that a lot of philosophers or Muslim graduates in philosophy with philosophy degrees or theology degrees, they would say, look, let's not use this stuff in the first place. This is not the stuff to use to critique Darwinism, let's just stick to our theology, because that's what conclusive evidence should be. And if we're going to engage with scientists at the level of science, you're always going to be falsified at some point in the future. So this is one of the hypothetical reasonings that is emerging from that kind of thinking. So what if transitional fossils are discovered in the future that are ancestral to the Cambrian phyla? So the answer that I would give, and many scientists will give, is that fossils cannot establish ancestral-descendant relationship right in the first place. So even if they found the fossils, it's a flimsy line of evidence, because fossils do not trace cause and effect. Because if I find something in my garden and there's a bone there that looks a bit like Australopithecines, and there's another bone in my garden that looks like Usman, then those two bones, I can make a lot of deductions and I can make a lot of correlations in the size of the bones, but what I cannot do is show for certain that there's a birth certificate with both of them telling me that these fossils are ancestor descendant to each other. That just cannot happen. And I don't understand, for one reason, that why do scientists have so much confidence in a line of reasoning that is based on a speculation, and yet they raise the epistemic weight of this to a conclusive level. It should not be the case, and we have that in our neo-Darwinist literature. Yes?
I've been reading about this for a long time,
Yeah.
and one of the things that occurred to me is that human thinking generally was, for example, we build chains of arguments or knowledge one on top of the other. So for example, you had mobile phones in the 80s or 90s, and now you have a smartphone. Another 20 years later, we're going to have something more advanced.
Yeah.
So I always think, is this not scientists almost juxtaposing human thinking, which it evolves and goes into one layer, one on top of the other, over sort of evidence, so as to say that they see. And the example I give is, for example, if I have a table with 3 cups nicely laid out, and a bit of bird poop 100 meters in the distance, it sounds logical that a bird came, pooped, laid those 3 glasses on the table and flew away. But anybody with a sane mind would say this is ridiculous. Isn't this idea of fossils kind of the same thing?
Very good question. So there was a scientist back in 1990s, his name was Tim Berra. He published a book refuting creationism using similar evidence. In a factory, thought about how we should design this particular product, and then they manufactured it. So this is not descent with common ancestry. This is descent with creation. This is creation of a mind of an engineer. Likewise, with the mobile example you gave, I will use the same line of reasoning, that when you go from one model to another model, you see change over time. And evolutionary biologists will tell the public at large, naive public, that look, here you have a kind of evolution. Just like that, fossils go through exactly the similar process. But the problem with that line of reasoning is, and as Tim Berra had blundered, is that this is not a evidence for common ancestry. This is evidence for common design. So the design is common, it's not the ancestor. And where is the common ancestry there anyway? Because it's the engineer, and they change their shifts, and there's different managers come, different people take over and design these products. So there is no common ancestry there. And Darwinist theory actually needs a process. That's actually a pattern. So what they tend to do, they give you a pattern of what's going on, and then they want you to assume the process must be what they have postulated. But that's not the right way of doing things. Science should be evidence-based, not dogma-based like that. This is dogmatic, because I've as a preconceived evolution already, that there must be a common ancestor to all terrestrial life, and now I'm going to fit in that in every single process that I'm going to apply to it to fit that same pattern. There is a scientist actually, and actually I'll use this as time to answer questions then, and with some conclusion. There's one scientist, Ford Doolittle. Professor Ford Doolittle is a biochemist. He has many publications against the universal common ancestry model, that's the tree of life model. And there's a paper, you can dig this up in the literature if you're interested, if you type in the Google search and put pattern pluralism, that paper will show you the conceptual problems here. Now, for Doolittle, he says that the pattern that evolutionary biologists have been holding to for centuries is a universal common ancestry pattern. However, that pattern doesn't fit the evidence. So he proposes pattern pluralism. He says science should be open to multiple patterns of the history of life. It shouldn't go right down to a single origin of life, as Ernst Mayr has argued. And he's not alone. That's the interesting thing about it, because he's one prominent scientist who studies the origin of life through a particular organism, cyanobacteria. But there's another scientist, Carl Waus. He's also, and he's a scientist, he's a microbiologist who studied he studied the origin of the actual the base of the tree of life, where the initial episode occurred, where that single-celled organism diversified into these different domains of life. Initially, the scientists proposed two domains of life known as eukaryotes and prokaryotes, but then he added a third domain of life called archaea, because that was not fitting the evidence. And then he went further and said that actually the single-celled organism doesn't exist, because there is no single origin of life the way we've been, the way you find in the Darwinian orthodoxy. So it's a big problem for them. Okay, what I'll do, I ran out of time actually, so I was hoping to finish all this off. So I'll just conclude on this last part, inshallah. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask at this point.
I was just going to ask you if it was possible for you to say just a little bit more specifically about human beings and criticism of neo-Darwinism, because I think that's the question in my mind. Yeah.
All right, so there is a book I read recently, about 2-3 years ago actually. It's written by David Solomon Jalajid, a South African researcher. It's called Islam and Biological Evolution. And Jalajid, he proposes a phylogenetic tree in which in humans evolution is possible only to the extent, and these are the proposed phylogenetic tree that he proposed, where Homo neanderthals and Homo sapiens, these are the two closely related hybridizing species, so they interbred amongst each other. Earlier, before 2010, the scientists believed that the Homo neanderthals and Homo sapiens, they didn't interbreed and they are separate species. More and more research is being done on the genome of these species, because Neanderthal genome can permit extraction of DNA, because it's not millions of years old. It's just thousands of years old. So they take the DNA and they've done sequencing on the nucleotides and made comparisons with the humans, and they now more and more finding that the Neanderthals and humans were interbreeding. Now the reason why I mention this example is, and also Jalajil is happy to include that as human being, Neanderthals as human being, insan, which we call in Arabic terminology, or bashar, because these species hybridize with humans. And if you're talking about speciation, which is a ancestral species diverging into two daughter species, it requires the biological concept of speciation to be enforced, which is the Ernst Mayer's concept of biological speciation. You cannot, how do we, in philosophy of biology is a problem of how to define species. But if you take the consensus, which is biological definition of species, then those two sister species, or so-called sister species, should not be able to interbreed amongst each other and produce a fertile offspring. Yet in Homo neanderthals and Homo sapiens, they are talking about hybridization. There was interbreeding and there was fertile offspring that lived on. And Neanderthals were not our direct ancestors according to the model. They were a clade, or kind of a offshoot from the ancestral humans. But the point is that wherever they were, they are humans based on the phylogenetic trees of some modern researchers in evolutionary researchers in Muslim world. and Jalaji is one example. So he shows that model. So I'm happy to go with that. I don't know whether I should say this, but I'm happy to even go further and to include a few other Homo species like Denisovans, even earlier, because I have a reason why I do that, is because the Quran and Sunnah is silent with regards to the definition of human being, the limits. What's the limit where you of human, insan? So if it's been left open by the Creator himself, then who am I to close those limits and draw a boundary that this is where human ends and this is where non-human starts? So for that reason, I tend to leave the question open-ended, that as more and more fossils are discovered, and although it's a speculative reasoning, and I'm happy to go with speculative reasoning because there is no conclusive reasoning from the scripture itself. A lot of people will object to what I say on this because they say that this is not qat'i, this is not evidence, this is violating aqidah. But I don't see it like that, because aqidah has to be proven from the mainstream sources, primary sources that are overwhelmingly agreeing on a particular definition. Here we got definition of insan not being agreed amongst the Muslim scholars. I'll give you one citation. Imam Razi, Fakhruddin al-Razi, has a 15 to 20 pages on this in his Mafatihul Ghaib, under the verse in Surah Bani Israel, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ. So I did say I wasn't going to quote Quran today, but it ended up being like that. I was thinking we'll go down that route anyway. Now this scholar, he says, what is haqiqatul insan? What is the reality of a human being? And then he goes on to say, giving a huge amount of opinions in support of the human is not physical entity. Human is not a physical entity. That doesn't mean a physical realm of creative episode didn't occur. That's not what I'm saying. I'm very tentative with this point, because a lot of people will just rubbish what I'm saying as he's opining that the creative episode of Adam and Eve was a symbolic. I'm not saying that. Body is a vehicle for the ruh, which is the internal potentiality of our existence. He is saying, Al-insan mawjudun bila jismin wala jismaniya. That human is existing without the body and physical nature. What does that mean? It means that the real essence of our humanity is not the physical body. The physical body you and me are carrying with us is prestigious to some degree, but it's not your essence. If it's not your essence, and then some Darwinian evolutionist tells you maybe the human has had some level of change, I see no trouble in accepting that. And it can be extended to quite a significant degree. People become very uncomfortable, and I've been asked questions where, to what degree are you extending it? Well, I don't extend it to any degree with any defined limits, because it's an open-ended problem. Because if theology hasn't defined it for you, then Usman cannot define it for you. Unless research is done and the scholars get together and say, insan has these physical limits. The only physical limits I am aware of is what the Quran says, shafatain, udhunain, there must be two eyes, or there must be a tongue, there must be lips, and these kind of things. But these are very arbitrary terms, because udhunain, even other species have them. So you see where I'm going with this. I don't want to corrupt your way of thinking in any way, but the point I'm mentioning is that the body changing over time should not be taken with any kind of fixed model in your mind that that's what it has to be, because Allah created that which you do not know. And what has happened in the history of life may be so drastically different to your assumptions about Allah's creation that you may be surprised when you wake up in the other side of the world in front of Allah and say, oh subhanallah, Allah's, this is a versatility of human species that He was able to change quite significant or insignificantly. Allahu A'lam. Yes.
One question I have about one thing that gets quite a lot is the random nature of evolution, or the random mutations. You keep hearing this about this in biological literature.
Yeah.
I looked up into the history of randomness and probability, and two French mathematicians in the 17th century, they came up with this idea of probability based on gambling games.
Okay.
I wanted to abstract the mathematics from them and use it to predict weather and all of these things. The thing that I find difficult is, as Muslims, we have the idea of qadr, predestination, as something that touched you was meant to touch you, and something that didn't touch you. So how does that go with this idea of random mutations? Because even if we assume that evolution did occur in some limited form, Allah would have, just like the engineers who guided the mobile phone, Allah would have guided each step of the way. So can you comment on that?
All right. See, so basically, the brother's question is related to randomness and contingency in evolution. Now, the thing is, in Darwinian evolution, natural selection is non-random, but the material that it acts upon is considered to be random. Now, when we talk about randomness of mutations, so let me just explain this a bit more. Darwinian natural selection cannot occur without some kind of natural material that permits change over time, and that natural material is genetic mutations in the traditional sense. There are other more explanations to that, but this is just in the classical sense. Those mutations are random with respect to benefit and harm. That's what the Darwinian evolutionists say. They are random with respect to whether they will increase the fitness of an organism. But they are not random in respect to the location where they occur. They're two different matters. Location is non-random. There are mutational hotspots where in the genome you have exons, introns. Introns are in between genes, exons are the genetic components. In human genome, there is about 3.2 billion nucleotides. Of the 3.2 billion nucleotides, 97 to 98% are intronic material, which is non-coding material, which many scientists have thrown out and saying it's a junk DNA, which we don't agree with. And there was a program known as ENCODE project where these elements have some kind of function associated with them as a regulatory function. But anyway, the point I'm making is the genomic material, which is the exonic material, which is where genes are coded from. Mutations don't frequently occur there. They occur more in the intronic regions. And then there are also hot spots where they occur. So it's not a random process in the sense of location, it's a random process in the sense of benefit and harm. Now, the other thing I want to mention, so the brother's question, in answer to that there is Mutu Kimura, which I mentioned to the brother in front, who proposed neutral theory of molecular evolution. He proposed that the mutations are either harmful for vast majority of them, they are harmful to the organism, so they accumulate harm to the organism, so they get over time these species become extinct, or they are near neutral, so there might be some benefit but not a pronounced amount. So if we take that and then we apply some other analysis to it, like one of the other professors from States, John Sanford, he wrote a book on this saying genetic entropy. The book is called Genetic Entropy, written around by 2005, and he takes that example and he says that if the mutations are near neutral, that they don't have no positive or negative effect, then over time these mutations will actually degrade the organisms and there will be no benefit as a cumulative phenomena. So the mutations are not purely random in respect to location where they occur, and even if they do occur, they do not add information to the genome, they actually reduce the information and degrade the genome, and if there are few beneficial mutations, they are not selected upon, because Kimura's model requires that mutations have to be large to be to be selected upon, and there are zones where their mutations cannot be selected upon.
Just two things. That has saved me asking you a question again. On the question of randomness, I mean, I've always felt that Darwinian evolutionists are not mathematicians, because with even those those genomes that mutate, the combinations required, the probabilities would be quite large, and also if it's true randomness, you'd get a high proportion of failed mutations, and there doesn't seem to be any evidence of those failed mutations. So that's the first question about randomness, and the other one is on consciousness, because they've tried to look at consciousness between human beings and primates, for example with the chimpanzee Nim, and people have almost accepted that there is a quantum gap between the consciousness, self-awareness of human beings and primates, and I see that also as a big problem. So I wonder what your views are on the problems of randomness in terms of mathematical numbers and the issue of consciousness of human beings compared to other species.
Okay, I totally agree with your first point in regards to mathematics. Randomness in biological evolution is a huge problem because it bars any intelligence. So when you say that these mutations happen randomly, you are barring any intelligence that may have caused those randoms. So there is a think tank in States who promotes an intelligent design interpretation of what's going on in the at the level of at the molecular level, and I'm quite comfortable to take their interpretation on that, because their interpretation sets limits to how much of what's going on at the molecular level can be considered as just a chance phenomena, and how much cannot be considered chance phenomena and cannot evolve in a stepwise, by Darwinian stepwise process. So if we take that kind of interpretation, then that randomness, it doesn't hold water in both worlds. It doesn't hold water even in intelligent design sense, but they don't really rest their claim on random mutations in the first place. They rest their claim on an intelligence, which is these things are designed and they refuse to identify the designer, but the actual detection of design through specified information or irreducible complexity is proposed at that level. So that's how the randomness is countered through some kind of scientific way, and the randomness is mathematical, as you mentioned. It's a theoretical deduction using mathematics, and by the way, population genetics is a field that scientists just love, and population genetics rests most of its claims on mathematics. There is no hard empirical data. So it's not an empirical inference, it's a mathematical deduction, and you rightly pointed that out, that randomness, whether we can empirically identify the randomness, is impossible, because it's absence of not knowing rather than confirmation of knowing what's going on. When we don't know the pattern, we will just cast it as random. So it's not an empirical inference, it's a lack of our mathematical tools in deducting what's happening at molecular level, and then we make our deductions based on that. So it's a theoretical deduction that rests entirely on mathematics. And maths is only useful to science when it tells us the truth. It's a deductive science. And when scientists start depending on mathematics without any empirical data, then they're doing the science wrong way around. Because science should be working from empirical data, then apply the mathematics. Here you apply mathematics right at the start without the empirical data. So I don't agree with randomness to that degree as it is, but where I do agree, because there is a statement in Arabic, la mushahata fil istilah. There is no harm if an individual defines his terms in a particular way, then to accept the way he's defined it. Now that randomness, that the way Darwinists define it, is with respect to a benefit and harm. To that level, I can agree with it, because we don't know by our current model, and it is a theoretical deduction, as you pointed out, it's a mathematical thing, but it's what we are seeing in nature, that we don't know whether so we don't know whether radiation is going to cause mutation in this room, certain individuals, and other individuals it won't. We can't pinpoint those individuals who are going to have mutations in their genome because of X-ray radiations, for example, or carcinogens. So with respect to our knowledge who are going to be affected, the Darwinists then say it's a chance phenomenon. It could happen to X, Y, and Z, and it can happen to A, B, C. And that type of chance phenomena theologically is not problematic. because even in Islamic fiqh, tossing, called Qura andazi, which is tossing to make some decisions based on that kind of chance, it might go one way or the other, is permitted. So it's not that it's a theological problem, but I agree with you, it's a mathematical theory, not empirical theory.
Just on the issue of lots and tossing, you've got the example of who would be the guardian of Maryam, and may Allah be pleased with her, and also with about throwing Ayub alayhi salam off the boat.
Yeah.
And you got the impression that although superficially they were random, the fact that, for example, with the lots for Maryam, they kept coming out the same, that there was a kind of a divine in there, and so they weren't really random.
Yeah, so the horizontal causation, vertical causation, some people refer to this. So you have Imam Ghazali adds something on this line of thought where he proposed something called occasionalism. So between the cause and effect, the chain, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created an aada, which is a regularity and customary nature of that this particular cause will have this particular cause will have this particular effect. But if we take out that metaphysical assumption and we fill it with the scientific metaphysics, some of the Darwinist metaphysical assumption, which is that cause and effect are linked necessarily, then including a horizontal causation into that model becomes a huge problem. So you're right that the problem is to do with metaphysics of what's going on at the level of cause and effect, rather than to do with the what we actually observe, because we can't observe that chain.
Yeah.
That chain is a philosophical worldview. So this is also, I think, David Hume and other Western philosophers and contemporary philosophers are following on to this, and they're using this. And there is a particular line of reasoning known as theistic evolutionism. Now these guys that use that line of reason say that God created the world through evolutionary processes. So we have no problem with evolution. It's the way it happened, but God did it. And if that's the case, but then the problem with that is, from my way of looking at it, is that you are bending for that worldview, and they're not really bending for you, because they are holding to that as a concrete model. There is no breakage in that cause and effect, but you are assuming that, okay, we can have that in the background of my mind, that this is aada and regularity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation, but they will not permit any miraculous occurrences in that. They've said that right from the beginning as their initial assumption. But in your worldview, you are accepting that. So you're not really taking on board the entirety of Darwinism, but what you're doing is you're saying that the actual way it's happening, it happened that way, but Allah has done it, or a divine has done it. So I find that very problematic, because it doesn't solve a lot of problems. One of the problems it doesn't solve is a human chimp model, because it just takes that on board. It says we did evolve from chimpanzees. We didn't evolve from chimpanzees. We and chimpanzees evolved from a prototype who is our common ancestor. That's another mistake we find in a lot of creationist literature, that they think that we came from monkeys or chimpanzees. That's not what scientists say. They say they are our relatives, but they are not our ancestors. So anyway, the problem is, you can see, common ancestry. How do we deal with that? Now, theology is quite explicit that we don't share that common ancestry, and it's quite vivid. And on the other side, you have theistic evolutionists. They're adopting that as an entirety of evolution, just filling in that there is a divine creator who's doing it all. So I find that very problematic. I rather approach the topic from either the intelligent design point of view, which I find very convincing, and a lot of people oppose me on that, but the problem is intelligent design is not theology, it's science, according to the way they pose the question. And science has no monopoly over what is scientists hold as an assumption when they are proposing a hypothesis. And here, these proponents of intelligent design, they have an assumption that there are certain features of life that are best explained through a designer rather than through a blind, unguided, undirected, unplanned watchmaker. as Richard Dawkins would have you believe. So if Richard Dawkins gets away with that in biology textbooks, it's in biology textbook, I didn't get to complete the lecture, but it's there. He gets away with the metaphysical assumptions of Darwinism inserted into our mainstream science. Then why should the intelligent design? And the argument that they are minority is a flimsy argument, because science always goes through minority to majority. If they're minority today, this research community will increase, and maybe in the future they find that there are some limits to Darwinian expectations, and they might not be able to jump those limits, and then Darwin has to be scrapped into history and a new model has to take over. And there is already that happening, because there are two biologists. One is named Dennis Noble, professor of physiology from Oxford, and another one, James Shapiro from States, is a microbiologist. They, together with another individual, launched a third way project, which has 64 prominent evolutionary biologists who signed up to a statement that Darwinian evolution, or the traditional one, which natural selection, is inadequate. We need to move on. So that's happening from 2014, and we've had from 2000 and early part of the last decade people signing up to statements where they're dissenting from Darwinism, and these are PhD scientists or MDs who are serving as professors. So these are not people, at the basic level. These are people who understand this stuff, and they are openly having problems and skeptical about some of these assumptions. So anyway, the thing is, there could be a paradigm shift. There could be things that in another 50 to 100 years, evolution won't go away, and I would suspect the essentialist worldview will come back. I don't think that will happen. Evolution will continue because we now already discovered so much in science, but it will continue maybe in an opposite direction to Darwinian evolution, towards an intelligent design type of model. And I'm happy to go with that as my working model when I do my research, and I won't be permitted to do that in my science thesis I submit to my supervisor. I probably throw it out of the window, but I can have that assumption as a scientist that I work according to that model and not the model of Darwinian evolution.
So, and just briefly about consciousness and human consciousness in particular.
Okay, so human consciousness between our species and other species, it's a neuroscience subject, which I'm not, I don't hold the right expertise. But what I would say that consciousness is caught the imagination of the public in one way, because people think that consciousness, it's a big problem for scientists, and they really don't have any explanation whatsoever. There is explanation for consciousness which is materialistic as well, and they believe that it's the emergent property of the matter that leads to the mental property of consciousness, and there are models proposed for that. So it's not that consciousness is just a supernatural property that cannot be explained through materialistic means. I don't hold a materialistic worldview, but I'm just explaining that there is some theoretical models that will explain consciousness materialistically rather than as a supernatural entity. Your question was that our consciousness and the consciousness of the other lower species of primates kind of have some similarity, right?
Well, I mean, my perception is there's a big quantum difference. I mean, from behaviouralists, they've found that primates don't have the self-awareness that we have. They've done language tests, and some of it, like with Nim, looked like it was unconsciously orchestrated by their trainer. It seems to be a big problem generally, because people who who are atheists but see this problem then come out with a kind of alien visitor who came down and mutated human beings, which to me sounds ridiculous. But it says to me that there's people who aren't religious who still see a problem with human beings being so significantly different from other animals.
I agree with your understanding of consciousness is a big problem for evolution, because they're stepwise process of how did such complex meta thinking in humans evolve from very primitive thinking of the other primate species. So I can understand, but I don't think it's as big problem for neo-Darwinian worldview as we think it is, because the hypothesis that can explain it is there. So whether the evidence is fitting that hypothesis or not, they have a hypothesis, as I mentioned, that consciousness can be reduced to some material form. So if they have that explanation, then if there's mutations, and then as a byproduct of those mutations, conscious evolves into higher conscious, and then higher conscious, and in a gradual increase, I think Darwinian evolutionists will go down that route, and they do go down that route. But I agree with you, and I'm sure most people here will also agree with the point that that kind of quantum leap that you're saying, if I was to show people on the board today a Grand Canyon and say I jump from this end of Grand Canyon to the other end of Grand Canyon, if I was to show that there's a little ditch and I jumped over, you'll say, yeah, of course you can, because you're quite a fit individual, and you can do that. But if you say that I jumped Grand Canyon, and you start doubting, you definitely say I'm gone mad, right? So here we have a Grand Canyon. How did it go from the other species to our species with a higher order thinking skills? It's a Grand Canyon. It's a very big difference. Although Darwinists want to reduce the gap and show it to you that no, it's not that big, it can be done, but mutations are very small and they happen gradually over time. They need to show. And another thing is, in Grand Canyon is the little buttes. Yeah? So what Darwinists tell us is that there's a Grand Canyon, and it's about 5,000 feet across, or 5,000 meters across, and I jumped it, and I'll say, hold on, that's a bit too extreme. How did you do that? They'll say, oh, no, I jumped it, and I'll tell you how I did it. There's many ways I did it. One is there was buttes that rose in the middle, that came to the surface, I put my foot on it, it went down, and I got another one butte coming up, and I did it that way. I.e., it's a historical phenomenon that I can never test. You see the analogy here. So that's what they've done with the most of evolution. They've told us there's Grand Canyons. We're seeing Grand Canyons, we're seeing them as a problem. But they're telling us there were buttes in the history that allowed them to jump the Grand Canyon with a step-by-step process. So this is the way they explain much of evolution, including the consciousness. But I agree that the consciousness is a problem. Like I also agree that even the physical traits evolving from one organism to another organism level itself is a trait. The complex body symmetry and the body plan itself evolving, like the phyla showed, is a problem. Even there's a problem inside the cell. There is a nanomachines in the cell that cannot evolve from one level to another without there being some intermediate explanations, which Darwin do not entertain. They won't entertain this stuff because this stuff is a problem. It poses a significant challenge to their worldview. And like I said, that they won't entertain it for other reasons, which is, will religious people fill the gap? And they don't want that to happen. But I've already filled the gap for myself, and I'm sure this is why I'm here, because this is the gaps we can fill, even if we're outside our science classrooms. And Shaykh mentioned in the beginning that scientists, of a doctor who goes into the his hospital having those assumptions of science, and then he comes out and he doesn't have those assumptions. I don't need to do that, because I hold the same assumptions whether I'm in the lab or I'm at home. The assumption is that the Darwinian explanation doesn't explain all the phenomena that I'm interested in. And if it cannot explain all the phenomena, and a vast majority of it cannot explain, then I already have another worldview that I subscribe to, which is able to comfort me, and I don't need to compartmentalize my life in that way and be subjected to dissonance.
Could you just
yes, sister.
If any sisters, yeah.
It seems to model that trade like you were referencing before in terms of its branches, and that's really what's your take on that.
Okay, so sorry, I missed the question because it was a bit.
Can you speak a bit louder?
Well, you can come to the front if you want, if that helps, inshallah.
But yeah, so some people think that the taxonomic classification system is a reflection of evolutionary history. I was wondering what's your take on that?
Okay, so the taxonomical classification.
Could you repeat the question for everyone?
So the question is that taxonomical classification of life is how history of biological, it represents history of biological evolution. Is that right? So sisters asked me to shed some light on that. That's the way Darwinists have proposed it, because they've given you a classification, and this classification they've given you right from the life right down to the species level. There are those levels, you know, in a hierarchy. So what they've done, these are arbitrary classifications. They're based on some criteria which, if you apply to another field of study, that criteria changes. So we don't really have a fixed exact place where these taxa are limited within. However, taking the way the taxa are, they are in Darwinian evolution representative of the history of life, because history of life came from life and it went down to the myriad species we have on Earth. But that's not the assumption we need to have, because from the observation point of view, we've only seen evolution occurring within varieties within species. Like, for example, let's give you an example. In textbooks you'll find peppered moths being displayed. You've probably seen those. And in Industrial Revolution in the 19th and 20th century in Europe, these peppered moths, they change color because of the soot and the this kind of organism grows on trees. It's, because of camouflage effect. This is the theory they give you. But leaving aside all the experimental problems of the theory and taking it at its face value, if we take that, what has occurred? We've had a reshuffling of frequencies. We've had white conspicuous moths being replaced with more darker moths. But what hasn't happened is, and will never happen based on the way we see it, the way we see nature, is that the moth becomes a butterfly or it becomes a dragonfly. That kind of level of speciation has not happened in nature. So what they do then is they go into the laboratories. Now this is coming to laboratory science, and they will introduce mutations inside the genome to see what effects it has at the shape of the fly or wherever the organism. So they do these fruit fly experiments where they introduce mutations, and the fruit fly develops extra set of wings, for example. Now those extra set of wings that the fruit fly has developed is by an artificial process, but Darwinian evolution requires a natural process. We need to see in nature. So then another scientist in Michigan State University saw these problems, Richard Lansky, in 1986, I believe. And he did an experiment on E. coli to show that over time whether there's evolution. The most he was able to see after around about 60 to 70,000 generations of keeping these in the artificial laboratory environment is that these E. coli only evolved to reduce the genome to be able to only live off a particular type of sugar that was being fed. And they lost the ability and switched off the genes that were able to metabolize other types of sugars. And the reason why I'm giving these examples is that there is no speciation beyond, there is no evolution beyond varieties, that from experimental science point of view. These are deductions and these are assumptions. Now, paleontologists are field scientists. They will show you a lot of fossils. They display on the table. But what they cannot show you, what the laboratory scientists will do, is show how it changes over time without me intervening. Minimal intervention from me as a scientist, let that happen itself. Richard Lansky did it, it didn't work. So there is no speciation, that hierarchy that we are talking about up to the life evolution has not happened in nature. It hasn't even happened beyond the species boundaries. Where has the species barrier been jumped in experimental science? I haven't come across one, and I'll be more than happy to leave my email, and inshallah people can email me those examples and I will look into it. So that's
one more question, possibly from sisters if they want to ask a question.
Yes.